Welcome to another version of ARCA's podcast, Elevated Views. I'm sitting down here today with Alan Speidel from Malarkey Roofing Products, Territory Manager for Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you.
So maybe for some of the people online here, can you give us a brief introduction of your roofing past? What got you into working with Malarkey, and kind of what is your scope of your role with Malarkey?
So my roofing past, that's a tough one. I've been selling roofing in some way, shape, or form for probably 25 years, but always on the sales side. Very little technical or practical roofing application experience. I'm a salesperson. Been with Malarkey now 14 years. What got me to Malarkey is I needed a job. I was leaving a job and looking for another, and Malarkey found out and hired me, like I said, 14 years ago. My role with Malarkey is basically business development, training, technical training, installation training. It's basically one-stop shop for anything Malarkey Roofing Products is basically what I do. The bulk of my day is spent with contractors, specifiers, consultants, stuff like that, and then through distribution.
So I know we've been involved in the past. We worked on a couple projects with the City of Calgary, and of course Malarkey's a proud member with the ARCA. So Malarkey has always been one of those manufacturers, and more yourself is that trusted resource. So when you're talking to people and they may not know a lot about shingles, what is the basic anatomy of a shingle?
So the first thing I like to start with is I like to clear the misconception that a shingle is a shingle. That is not the case. All shingles are more or less made in a similar way in that we're coating fiberglass mat with asphalt front and back, covering the top side with colored stones. So Mr. and Mrs. Smith have something to match the rest of their exterior, but the stones from a manufacturing standpoint, or the granules on the top, really are there to keep the sunlight away from the asphalt. So that's the role of a shingle. There are basically two different ways to make a shingle, one called oxidized. That technology is over 100 years old. And then there's polymer-modified. And Malarkey's role in shingles, or what separates us, is that every shingle we make is polymer-modified. Polymer-modified shingles have a number of advantages over oxidized, and that's sort of where we kind of took a fork in the road back in the late 80s and where we are today.
So what kind of advantages do you get with the polymer-modified?
The big advantages of a polymer-modified shingle is, first and foremost, your granule retention is far better. So the longer we can keep the granules, or the colored rocks, as I referred to them earlier, on that shingle surface, the longer that shingle is going to last. So you've got life cycle cost or asset management advantages from a polymer-modified shingle. The other advantages are very good wind performance, because the shingle doesn't get as brittle in the cold. We can install a polymer-modified shingle to minus 15 Celsius. Most other shingles, or most oxidized shingles, plus 4, plus 5 degrees Celsius is kind of where you stop installing. So we can install in colder weather. And one of the reasons I'm probably sitting here is that a polymer-modified shingle will withstand some impact. So it will perform better in a hail event or a storm event with wind than a non-oxidized shingle.
Before we talk about the different classes, I'll ask the elephant in the room question is, do polymer-modified shingles cost more than just the regular oxidized?
Yes. So a polymer-modified shingle is more expensive than an oxidized shingle. And the main reason is the polymers you're adding in are expensive.
And especially in Alberta, I think that would have its advantages, because we don't only like to roof 4 months out of the year when you are above that plus 4. I know, being involved with the National Technical Committee with the CRCA, they were quite surprised when I pulled up the average temperatures throughout Alberta all the way from January to December, and there's really only 4 months out of the year that we don't have frost. So that can really affect the installation, because I'm sure there are some contractors out there who would install in less favorable conditions, but then ultimately that impacts the life cycle of those shingles as well. You talked about the hail resistance. Am I correct in saying I think all Malarkey, I think all the ones with the ARCA are a class 4 under the STM for hail resistance. But what is the difference between the different classes of shingles when it comes to, say, hail resistancy?
So first of all, the hail resistance test, there's two different tests that you can adhere to. There's the FM 4473 or there's UL 2218. We adhere, all of our shingles, we follow the testing of the UL 2218 test. There's 4 classifications for impact resistance, class 1, 2, 3, and 4. You don't really ever hear about class 1, 2, and 3 because the insurance companies haven't made them meaningful in Canada. So we really only hear about class 4. Now what the tests are, the UL test is dropping a stainless steel ball bearing from a designated height onto a shingled deck and then checking the shingle for damage. So in the case of a class 4 test, we're dropping a 2-inch diameter ball 10 times onto a shingle, twice on 5 different locations. And after every drop of the ball, the shingle is checked for a crack or fracture that could result in the leak. So they're checking the back side of the shingle for cracks or fractures that result in a leak. So class 3, don't quote me on this, but a class 3 drops a 1 3/4 inch ball. I think class 3 is a 1 3/4 inch ball from 17 feet. Class 4 is a 2-inch diameter ball dropped from 20 feet. And then class 2 and class 1 would be smaller diameter ball bearing dropped from a lower distance. So the higher you drop the ball from, the more impact you're going to generate, the more speed. And that's the test. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. Stainless steel ball bearing is cylindrical, it's smooth, it's dropped from a certain angle. We know that hail can come in many different shapes and sizes. It can be jagged, it can come at different angles. The 2 tests that are out there are the best thing available today. Do they replicate hail? No. And that's why you have an impact rated test and no one really gives a hail warranty because hail comes in all different shapes and sizes. So the shingles are tested for impact rating. Every shingle Malarkey makes passes class 3 or class 4. And as you mentioned, all of the ones that are ARCA approved today all pass class 4.
How long has this testing been around? Is it a relatively new development?
That I'm not sure. I've been with Malarkey coming up to 15 years and it's been around for that long. If I remember, I think the testing started in the 90s. And I think it's been around since then. And to my knowledge, there's been very little change in the testing. There's been talk of some more rigorous tests, but we haven't seemed to cross or jump that hurdle yet.
So one interesting thing that you pointed out is during the tests, and obviously probably for in situ or jobs that have already been done, a lot of that damage is on the back side of the shingle. It's not on the front of the shingle. What do you notice on the back side?
Well, what they look for on the back side is a crack or a fracture. So the impact hits the shingle and it actually cracks or fractures the fiberglass mat through to the backside. The reason that's what they look for is that cracking or fracturing now leaves a hole, which then can result in a leak. There's 2 parts to the hail thing. You need to be concerned with what the hailstone does to the surface of the shingle, because if it knocks all the granules off, but doesn't crack or fracture it through to the back, as a homeowner, you're going to have to replace your shingles very rapidly because the granules are gone. If you remember a few years ago, a few manufacturers brought out some class 4 products that had a scrim on the back side. There was nothing different. It was an oxidized shingle with a scrim put on the back. That enabled them to pass the class 4 test, but in the real world, when the hail came, the shingles didn't crack or fracture, so potentially your claim was denied, but all the granules got beat off the roof. So back to my earlier thing, like one of the big advantages of a polymer-modified shingle is the granule retention is far better. That leads to the shingle lasting longer and also leads to it performing better in a hail event.
So if I'm looking at shingles, would I notice any difference between a polymer-modified shingle and an oxidized shingle class 4 just by looking at them?
No, they would look exactly the same. Once you started to touch it or feel it, if you could put it in your hands, you could feel a difference then, because the polymer modified, it'll be more flexible. It'll feel a little more supple and not as rigid and boardy. But to look at the two shingles, they look exactly the same. They're going to be rough and dirty, the same thickness. If anything, a polymer modified shingle could be thinner than an equivalent oxidized and still have better performance because of the polymers in there. But the look of them will be exactly the same.
So you mentioned the lower temperature restrictions. Are there any upper temperature restrictions? Are there any temperatures where it is too hot to install the polymer modified shingles?
With any shingle, you need to be careful in very high temperature or very warm temperature installs. Yes, because the polymer that's in the shingle, it's kind of a rubber-like substance. When it is warm out, 30 degrees Celsius, the shingles can tend to scuff when you're up and down crawling on the roof, but that's the same with any shingle, oxidized or not. Another misconception out there with a lot of homeowners is that they don't want a shingle in the cool months because the shingles don't adhere and stick together as well. The flip side of that is in June, when it's 30 degrees, or in July, if it's 30, 35 degrees, you can have a lot of scuffing issues during an installation. Really, the ideal temperature probably for asphalt shingle installation is probably high teens to mid 20s is probably the ideal temperature. I tell homeowners every day, there's as many things that can go awry in the middle of July at 30 degrees as there is in November at 5 degrees.
Now, in addition to the temperature restrictions, are there any different installation procedures between the two types of shingles?
Nope, the shingles are installed the same way. So a polymer modified shingle is installed exactly the same as the oxidized shingle. They handle a little different on a warm day. A bundle of polymer modified is going to be a little more droopy. It's going to be softer, but basically the installation is exactly the same.
Now, we worked together with the City of Calgary a couple of years ago when they did their roofing resiliency program. Another aspect of shingle roofing that I think people don't quite understand is the shingles are a component of the roof, but they're not the only thing with the roof. There's the underlayment, the ice and water shield, the proper ridge caps, the proper nailing patterns. There's a lot more that goes into it than just one product.
Absolutely. The shingles are part of a roof system, and Malarkey or any other manufacturer out there is going to tell you that. In my opinion, every roof should have underlayment on it. Every roof should be installed with 6 nails in an area like Alberta where it is quite windy. It enables that roof, should you have an incident where you have a shingle blow off or something happens, that underlayment is there as a second line of defense. And whatever underlayment you're choosing to use, whether it's synthetic, an ice and water, whatever, you want an underlayment on that roof as part of a system. Like I said, it's there for a second line of defense. It may save you an emergency repair, some blow-offs from a wind event. So yeah, all part of a roof system. Every manufacturer is going to promote ice and water at the eaves and in the valleys and around any penetrations, some sort of an underlayment on the entire roof deck, and then your shingles and your capping to finish it off.
We like to refer to that here as it's got belts and suspenders.
Yeah.
You always have the first line of defense, but you always have that backup just in case. Now, you mentioned specifically here in Alberta, and since your territory is really the Canadian prairies, do we share the same attributes across 3 provinces, or is it different in each one?
The attributes are a little different. I personally think that Alberta has one of the harshest climates for roofing products, and that's mainly because of here in Calgary, the Chinooks and the freeze thaw we get. We tend to get more cycles of freeze thaw than just about anywhere in North America, and that can be very, very challenging and hard on a roof. In the winter, you can get ice dams, then they defrost. In Calgary, you could get ice dams 3 times in a winter, depending on the temperatures and what we get. So there are similarities across the prairies, but like I said, I think Alberta has one of the harshest climates for any roofing material, mainly because of the freeze thaw. Some would argue maybe Manitoba and Saskatchewan are just as harsh because they tend to get a little bit more of the hot temperatures in the summer than specifically Calgary does. They're similar, but there are some slight nuances from province to province.
Now with the Malarkey and with the shingles, you guys also have approved applicators.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
What would be your big difference between, say, an approved applicator and someone that just goes out and installs the shingles? I know the last time Calgary had the hailstorm, there was an influx of over 1,000 roofing contractors into Alberta to help with those repairs. But people also have to be aware it is a skilled trade that is going to be installing that.
Absolutely. So Malarkey does have what we call a certified contractor program. And I'm not going to sit here and profess that any Malarkey certified contractor has some extra special installation training. It's just not possible. You just don't have the manpower to do that. And with many of the companies in Alberta and in the prairies using sub-crews, often it's very difficult to even get to the person installing that roof. So what the certified contractor program does for the homeowner is it vets that contractor that, one, they're legitimate business, they've got their WCB, they've got a business license, they've got insurance, and we only will allow contractors that have a minimum of 3 years in business. Is it the end-all be-all? No, but it is helpful to know that Malarkey has investigated these contractors. They're in good credit standing with their suppliers. They've been in business at least 3 years, and they do have a business license, they do have insurance, and they do have all that stuff. Does it mean that certified installer is a better installer than the non-certified one? Not necessarily, but it means they've reached out, they became certified. They have gone through a bit of a vetting process.
It's just that due diligence. You won't get the tail light warranty that once that contractor decides to leave, all you get is what's in their rearview mirror.
It's really trying to weed out what we refer to as Larry ladder or chuck in a truck. Here in Alberta, there's no impediment to becoming a roofer. I could leave here today, go buy some nails and a nail gun at Home Depot, print a few business cards, and I could be a shingle contractor tomorrow. That's just the reality.
And that's when they start calling both yourself and me and
yes,
start to ask all the questions.
And that's part of the reason that City of Calgary brought out the resiliency program is back in 2020 when the last big storm hit, as you said, there were 1,000 all of a sudden new contractors that popped up, many of whom had never installed a roof, unfortunately.
Weren't really looking out for the best interest of the homeowner.
Not always.
So it's been a very interesting discussion. Are there any other items that I may have gone over too quickly or forgot to mention from your side? Since you represent that product each and every day and you do a great job, I know, doing it.
I don't think so. Like I said, I would just reiterate for anyone listening is that don't get fooled. A shingle isn't a shingle isn't a shingle. There are differences in shingles, and you don't always have to upgrade to some sort of composite roof or concrete tile or whatever. You can get a better shingle roof. You just have to know what you're looking for. And in most cases, that shingle will be polymer modified. And it is the way I think that shingles will continue to go in the future. More and more companies will make more and more polymer modified shingles. And it just does outperform that regular, what I call builder grade oxidized shingle.
One thing I wanted to ask about the class 4, if it goes through an extreme hail event, does that shingle, if it's not damaged, does that continue to perform? Or is the hail going to impact the life cycle if it goes through a storm?
I don't get to see enough roofs with my own eyes. I just don't get on enough roofs to see. There is some testing being done in the US on that exact same thing now through the IBHS, which is the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. So they now have weathering fields in the US that are testing specifically that. I would tell you from my knowledge that if you have a severe hail event with a class 4 roof, it survives, there's no damage. I think common sense and logic tells you you've probably lost a few years of lifespan off that shingle. You are going to lose some granules and whatnot. But as far as the ability of that shingle to withstand another hailstorm, that shouldn't be impacted at all. What will impact the shingle's ability to withstand hail is probably just the age of that shingle. And that's with any shingle, whether it be oxidized or polymer modified. As the shingle ages, it's going to lose some of that suppleness. It's going to get more brittle as it ages. It's essentially up on your roof baking. 10 years down the road, 15, 20 years, it's not going to perform the same as it did year one. But a polymer modified shingle, because you've been able to keep all the light oils and stuff in that asphalt, however many years down the road, that shingle should still outperform an equivalent aged oxidized shingle, if that makes sense.
Is there any testing on shingles that shows how the aging shingle reacts?
There is. It's just starting to come out now. And again, that is another thing that is being driven by the IBHS. So that group of people out of South Carolina, they are starting to release some data there. It's all American based. So that's starting to come out now. I will profess I haven't read too much of it, but the IBHS is very, very involved with testing 5-year-old shingles, 10-year-old shingles, but it takes time because they're doing it the proper way by actually leaving the shingles in a test field for however many years and then going out and retesting them. So that data will continue to evolve and come out, but like I said, it will take time for the shingles to just age naturally and not for a test that kind of cheats the aging, sticking them in an oven or something like that.
Perfect. Well, this has been great, Alan. You pointed out a lot of very interesting comments, and I always like to learn everything every day. I've even learned something, so thank you very much for stopping by, and hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Appreciate it. I thank you for the invite, and like I said, maybe look forward to doing another one in the near future. Thank you, Kevin.
Sounds great. Thanks. Thank you for listening to another episode of ARCA's Elevated Views. We hope you have enjoyed the program. For additional information on ARCA, our contractors, or our program, please go to arcaonline.ca. Or you could follow us on Instagram at Roofing Careers or on LinkedIn at ARCA-Alberta Roofing Contractors Association. Thanks and have a great day.